If you look at it all, it's still only 3% of the aid required.
With the axis of evil, Iran could have done something.
So the danger here is actually this American thing actually arrives just in time for the end of the war. And this is the third time that the Ukrainians have attacked it. But this time
They got it. You can build a drone in 5 days. Takes you about 20 years to build a warship. To me, I can imagine the First Sea Lord for Russia going to Putin and say, "Can I just give you an update, sir?" He said, "How's it going?" "Well, I've lost another 5 ships, sunk to the bottom of the Black Sea, and 25% of my fleet is missing." And Putin says, "I'm a bit irritated by that." Don't think so.
Orban said afterwards, Trump has no intention of continuing to back Ukraine.
Yeah. The number one objective of any politician is to get re-elected. So last week we had quite a good chat about getting aid into Gaza, the difficulties of getting it in, the politics of it. We looked at the comparison between a plane, which is, the optics are very strong, but actually it's very little aid gets in. It's difficult to get it out of the plane down to people. Now there's been some new developments, both in America and the EU. Can you explain what everybody's trying to do now to help?
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, as you said, the trouble is not just getting the aid out, it's also, there's some horrible pictures of it getting very close to hitting people. There were alleged reports that 5 people had been killed on the ground by the aid landing on them or hitting them. And although we can't verify that, I wouldn't be at all surprised. It does appear Ursula von der Leyen's talked about a new ship, the Open Arms, which is now going to sail apparently from Cyprus. Should have set sail, done its first trip by the time this podcast goes out. Sounds very positive. 200 pallets of aid and also towing a barge of 200 tons of rice in there as well. But if you look at it all, it's still only 3% of the aid required. They're planning to do that return trip every 24 hours, but how you distribute it or what is the real question. But the US has also stepped in and said they're going to now build a pontoon setup, because part of the challenge with ships is that they need deep water. There's not deep water close to the shore in Gaza. Therefore, how would you get the aid from a deep water ship out at sea and get it ashore? Now, that same problem was what happened in the Second World War, trying to get supplies ashore for the liberation of France, and they used Mulberry harbours at the time. The US still has a version of that available, and that apparently now has set sail from the US. So they do seem to be planning to set up a Mulberry harbour type affair, and they're promising that when it's in place that they'll be able to deliver 2 million meals a day for the Gazans, which of course will actually meet their requirement. Quite exactly how it's going to work, how the security arrangement's going to work, because this aid, at the moment, every time we see aid being dropped, there's absolute carnage. Law and order is broken down. How on earth you make sure the aid gets to those who need it and also doesn't find its way necessarily to Hamas. But I don't know how the aid agencies are going to do that. So without the Americans putting boots on the ground, and they've said they're not going to do that. So there's lots of questions still about how this is actually going to work.
First of all, I think that sounds like very good news. You know, how could it not be? I think firstly, I think there's politics in this as well, and that just sort of disturbs me a bit. And it's not until the thing has become an international disaster, humanitarian disaster, that suddenly people are piling in with offers of help. We know what a disaster is. We're very used to, as a world, knowing exactly how to respond to a disaster anywhere in the world. A volcano goes off, there's an earthquake somewhere, you know, within days we're in there. It's very easy to predict what was going to happen here with such a small, overpacked territory. There's a number of countries that could have done something much sooner. And I'll start, you know, with the axis of evil. Iran could have done something. Hezbollah could have done something. Egypt could have done something. Israel could have done something. The European Union could have done something. America could have done something. They didn't. And I'm grateful they're doing something now. I just think they're just too slow. Sure.
I think the politics is always going to complicate the issue. I think what's fascinating over the last few days, though, which I think is the big shift, is that America and the UK and probably most of the EU were fully behind Israel. Heinous acts of 7th of October, entitled to self-defense, you know, giving him almost a blank check. now you wind the clock forward to early March, and we've now gone over that 100,000 casualties, over 30,000 Palestinians killed, over 70,000 injured, vast majority women and children. But more importantly, probably, is this humanitarian disaster that's probably going to consume more lives than the war ever has to date. And all of a sudden now, the international community is bypassing Israel to put international aid straight in. Israel is controlling the checkpoints. One of the things that was disturbing for me was I went, okay, maybe there's just not enough aid getting to them. There is no shortage of aid. The problem is the Israelis stopping it getting over the border. They're doing checks on it to make sure, and there are reports, I listened to one interview from an aid worker who said some of this aid was being turned away because there were surgical scissors in the pack-up. They could be used as a weapon. And another one that was turned away because it had peaches apparently in it. Well, the nuts can be used as weapons.
Yeah.
And I sort of, what? But apparently that was one of the reasons why there's such a very slow progress of aid through the checkpoints.
Yeah. I mean, I can believe that lorries would be checked. Okay. It's a war. You don't want to feed your enemy. You also don't want to use it for arms to come in. I think checking peaches out and small surgical scissors, I just don't know whether to believe it. I mean, it's if this information is coming from UNRWA, who there's a lot of suspicion. International agencies have stopped funding for a while, although they've amassed a fair budget prior to this. I don't know whether I can believe any of that. It sounds all a bit crazy to me, but I'd say play on all of them because. It's despite the fact this is a war, and you can come up with loads of reasons why aid shouldn't get in. Aid should get in, and but with international cooperation between all parties, it could have been done much sooner and to greater volumes.
Yeah, I mean the UNRWA thing is interesting because I think the subtext of what you're saying is UNRWA is that trustworthy, is that. But the harsh reality is that whatever UNRWA is or was, even if it does infiltrated by Hamas, they would want aid to be getting through. Why would they say why aid wasn't getting through for the sake of they'd be incentivized to get it through? They wouldn't. Yeah. So from my perspective, it's much more about why is Israel making it difficult? And to be fair, you only have to go back a few weeks. Netanyahu was really clear. If you can guarantee the aid won't go into the hands of Hamas and therefore feed the very people that we're trying to exterminate, then we'll let the aid through.
Yeah.
But you can't guarantee that. Therefore, I'm not going to, why would I be incentivized? I need to get on with the war, stop slowing me down the West, get on with the war, exterminate Hamas, then we can solve the humanitarian crisis. And what's disturbing is that what we're seeing playing out at the moment is that price a price worth paying? And the international community now seems to have shifted from wholehearted support from Israel now to going, this just isn't reasonable anymore.
Well, would you mind me giving it a different interpretation of what's going on? Well, I think back to your own comment. Yes, they are motivated to get aid in. They're also, some of them, how many, to what depth it's been infiltrated, who knows. They might be motivated to do an anti-Israel PR, which is they wouldn't let peaches in because the stones could be used as weapons. So, who knows what to believe. The other thing, I can easily imagine, Joe Biden and others who are going for votes at the moment are worried about local issues and local support coming to an election. I can quite imagine a conversation between Israel and America to say, look, I've got politics here. I've got to look to be doing the right thing. So let's just agree. I'm going to be looking as though I'm out on my own here delivering aid. It's not going to affect you. There might be a bit of a PR kickback, but so what? You're big enough, bold enough, and ugly enough. So I'm going to get on with this. And I'm going to build up here, and it's all going to be fine. It'll solve my problem. It's not going to affect you. I mean, I'm absolutely certain, Sean, the politics of it is fierce. Those sort of conversations are going on anyway, which means it's not actually America pushing back against their original support for Israel. It's just, for the time being, doing what the local politics dictate.
No, and I think both the lines actually are, they're not contrary, actually. I don't disagree that there are some optics here, that the further this has gone on, Rishi Sunak, our own Prime Minister, it becomes more and more difficult to provide wholehearted support for Israel when
Vocal, yeah.
when there is such a vocal body of opinion, marches that are growing in intensity. It's all very well calling them blanket hate marches, when actually it feels like there's people going, this isn't right. This just is not right. Too many people are suffering. Too many people are dying. We shouldn't be standing by and watching this happen. And I think from the US perspective, I don't disagree. But in a way, isn't that democracy working? Because actually, if the people are now putting pressure on their leaders to say something's got to be done, the UN Security Council, the US blocked a resolution that would have allowed this to come to an end. And actually, all of a sudden now, that's backfiring a little bit on President Biden because the population is going, whether you're pro-Israel, pro-Palestinians, in a way, it doesn't matter. What matters is pro-humanity in the middle now. This just doesn't feel right. It feels it's got completely out of control. And I suspect that's another reason why it's probably the international community is now kicking. But let's bear in mind, this pontoon, it's not going to appear today, tomorrow, next week, next month. It's probably going to be a couple of months before this thing is actually up and running. By that time, we were expecting at Ramadan that the Israeli forces would move into Rafah, target those last 4 battalions of Hamas, and finish the war in a matter of weeks. So the danger here is actually this American thing actually arrives just in time for the end of the war, rather than actually when potentially the floodgates would open for aid anyway. That's the cynical view from me. But at least it feels there is an answer in play now, however late, however much that the aid drops and other things are not meeting the full requirement. At least it does appear finally that there is a solution in place that should deliver the quantity of aid that's required.
Well, let's hope that the pontoon and the open arms programme from EU actually work and deliver some.
But the question is, do you think Netanyahu's being damaged by this? Because he seems increasingly isolated now. Benny Gantz, one of the members of his Security Council, was off on America being treated like a leader. He was also met by Rishi Sunak, treated as a leader. It makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes. If Benny Gantz may be being courted, would you see the ingredients here of potentially a mutiny against Prime Minister Netanyahu? Because he hasn't done very much to get the hostages out. There are protests in Tel Aviv. The army is now getting a lot of casualties itself. It's starting to attract a lot of criticism because some of the online stuff that's going on. Also, the Israelis are now suffering because what's happening in Gaza appears inhumane. You just wonder whether something's going to happen around Netanyahu in the near future.
Well, I mean, he's not been their most favourite prime minister for some time. Any new leader in Israel, my prediction, I mean, you can disbelieve half of my predictions, like most people that make them, is going to face the same issues. Because this conflict in the Middle East is not going to end when this particular part of the war finishes. And we've got an ongoing problem, I think.
I agree with you, but I do think part of the answer will probably lie in Netanyahu being unable to be at the helm once the war is over.
Yeah.
He's the very public face of this war. If it's true that Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, that he never predicted that this would be the outcome, then part of that is because Prime Minister Netanyahu felt it was on his watch, security had broken down, maybe they should have predicted it, and actually we're going to go and destroy, we're going to declare war and go after them. I'm not sure that was a reaction that anybody expected, and increasingly the polls in Israel have gone, actually, is this winnable? Is this the right thing to do? And there's been some public comment now that actually his actions may be harming Jews globally because they feel increasingly uncomfortable given the criticism of what Israel's about. I do wonder about whether Netanyahu's position here is becoming increasingly untenable.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I put money, not much, but I put money on the fact that the international vocal response, at least, will change after November this year, when, for example, we have both a new president in America, well, maybe not a new one, but Biden maybe a second term or somebody else, or Donald Trump, he's now the Republican candidate, and the same in the UK. Once they've got more of a runway ahead of them, you know, the urgency of the tone might change. So that'd be interesting to see, Sean. Sean, we've spoken a lot before about Ukraine not having a navy and yet being quite successful in schwacking Russian ships. And they've managed to damage or /sink a large handful, and now something like 25% of the Black Sea fleet. That's quite a big impact. How have they done it?
Well, it's a huge impact, as you say, for the Ukrainians that don't have a navy. Normally, you'd expect the country with a navy to dominate the Black Sea. That is not the case. How have Ukraine done it? Well, over the last few weeks, they've been using this Magura V5, which is a sort of drone that runs around the water. It's quite big. It's not one of these handheld things. It's 1,000 kilograms in weight. It's got a 250 kilogram warhead. Actually can run around at about 50 miles an hour, so it's pretty swift as well. Remote controlled. It can travel about 400 miles if necessary.
Really?
Yeah, and Magura is the name. Apparently, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but it's based on the Slavic for goddess of war. And the Ukrainians have been very effective at using these against shipping. The most recent Sergei Kotov, which if you look at pictures of it, we'll show you pictures on here, but it's got lots of stealth lines about this ship. It's obviously low radar profile, low radar cross-section. It's only launched in 2021, and this is the third time that the Ukrainians have attacked it, but this time
they got it,
and there's some fantastic footage of them using swarm attacks to get it. But it's
like several drones at once.
Absolutely, yeah. And
are these kamikaze drones, or do they come?
Yeah, no, they're kamikaze drones, remotely controlled, and apparently coming from they struck the left, right, and rear almost simultaneously. But what's interesting about the footage, because the Russians, it's not the first time they've been attacked by these. So one of the best defences you'd think is radar. Well, these are made of plastic, so it's quite difficult for radar to pick them up. Can you hear them? They're very quiet, so it's quite difficult to hear them coming. So you've got to be able to see them. As soon as they see them, the best defence that Russians decide is line all of their sailors up on the deck with guns and fire bullets at them.
It's a bit old-fashioned, but...
Yeah, but it sort of worked. Then they realised that by attacking at night, they didn't know where their bullets were landing, so you don't know whether you're... So they started putting tracer, the Russians putting tracer, you know, those little once every 5 rounds or once every 10. Yeah, so that it just glows. You can see where the rounds are going.
Yeah.
And of course, that meant they could get aim better. So, of course, for the Ukrainians who are driving these vessels can now see where the bullets are going and dodge them.
Yeah.
They can, dodge away. So it's a really interesting whole...
Cat and mouse, yeah.
No, exactly. And the Ukrainians have been very successful at taking out this vessel. And apparently now, what's interesting is that the vessels they took out, a lot of them were firing surface-to-surface missiles, so ballistic missiles at Ukraine. I understand now, I think, that the numbers were that they've managed to down 5 of these ships that have been actually firing these. Now the Russians have only got 10 ships total. I think they include 3 submarines in that total that can fire these missiles at Ukraine, but they've all fled to the east side of the Black Sea. And
just push them, yeah,
because they're scared. And the Russian chief of the navy, I think his name was Nikolai Yevmenov, has just been sacked because he's lost so much of his navy. So all of a sudden, this one of the most powerful navies in the world, admittedly, we're only talking about that remains in the Black Sea, has been absolutely decimated.
Well, you can build a drone in 5 days. Takes you about 20 years to build a warship.
One of the reasons why President Zelensky was trying to have 1 million drones be built by his nation is they've been so successful at using these drones. Mainly for the small ones, but also as soon as you arm them, they can create all sorts of havoc. Over the last few days, they've been using them to attack fuel depots, Russian fuel depots and the like, but undoubtedly at sea. And I think although from my perspective, drones are more of an irritant. They're not going to change the tide of the war generally, but they're really irritating when your stuff's being blown up, behind your front line. But what's interesting about the naval side is that if you run the clock back about 18 months, there was a real worry that Russia was going to attack Odessa from the sea, do an amphibious landing, because Russia seemed to want to take the whole of the coastline. And at the time, it was a credible threat. If you look at what Ukraine's done to the Black Sea Fleet Navy, almost certainly that isn't an option for them anymore. So they've actually had a material difference to protect one of their flanks, which is Odessa.
And the supply lines.
They've also stopped some of these missiles being launched against Ukraine. And thirdly, I think most interesting is Ukraine desperately needs currency. It needs to generate something for its economy. Grain was the big thing. Russia's naval fleet sitting out at sea. Any of you ships come out of port, you've had it. Now Russia's all disappeared off to the east. So actually now Ukraine can get its grain out and earn vital revenue to pay for its war effort.
Yeah, fascinating. I chuckled when you used the word irritating. The drones are irritating. 5 ships, 25% of the Black Sea Fleet seems quite a lot to me. I can imagine the First Sea Lord for Russia going to Putin and say, "Can I just give you an update, sir?" He said, "How's it going?" "Well, I've lost another 5 ships, sunk to the bottom of the Black Sea, and 25% of my fleet is missing." And Putin says, "I'm a bit irritated by that." Don't think so.
Well, exactly. I mean, it is worth pointing out that I'm sure viewers will remember that, the Black Sea is controlled. It's one point of entry, Bosphorus Straits. That's controlled by Turkey. Turkey, in a time of war, will not allow any military vessels either way. So both Ukraine and Russia only have the vessels that are in the Black Sea for the duration of the war. Russian Navy is much bigger than that. But for now, that's all they can use. And to schwack 25% of that, as you say, that's more than an irritant. And although I'd be the first to argue that the only real metric of success of this war is territory. That's why Russia is grinding away on the front line, still in winter, taking huge casualties, but on the front foot, because it knows that Ukraine is short of weapons. More about that later. But my goodness, Ukraine is still having a major impact on some of the lines of communication and strategically, despite not having a navy, intimidating and scaring the Russian Navy into a completely different corner of the war.
Yeah, real strategic advantage.
Absolutely.
So turning to Ukraine, it seems to me, Sean, that Putin is still fairly wealthy. He's got lots of sources of commercial income. Zelensky, far less so, and Zelensky is having to rely a lot on foreign aid. And we know there's been a lot of political fights about how much he should get, whether he should get it at all. We're in the midst of elections, which can throw all sorts of swerve balls at people until that sort of calmed down, both in the UK and America. What's the latest situation on Zelensky continuing to see the flow of dollars so he can afford to fund the war?
It's a fascinating time, I think, because I'd pick you up and say I'm not much sure it's the flow of dollars, it's the flow of weapons. Because even if he's got dollars, you can't nip down to your supermarket and buy the weapons he needs. I think what we're seeing every now and again, this week we've seen President Biden say they've launched another $300 million worth of weapons, ammunition and artillery that's going Ukraine's way. Now that sounds great, but even the Americans were first to admit that actually this is a little too little and a little too late, and it ain't going to last very long. We've also seen on Tuesday, Denmark's announced a similar size, a package of aid. They want to get some ammo and artillery rounds in quickly. That sort of provides a sense of reassurance that actually Ukraine is now going to be okay. But unfortunately, in that same week, President Trump was speaking to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who Orban said afterwards, Trump has no intention of continuing to back Ukraine.
Yeah, on the basis that he's going to force people to get around a table.
Yeah, there's a deal to be done. And the worrying thing about that is, whatever this politics going around, Ukraine is actually on the back foot at the moment. Russia is pushing forward. Now, if you were Putin and you heard that sort of statement and you knew at the start of this war, as long as you play this long, the West is going to get tired of this war, they'll stop supporting it, and I'll be free to get on with this war. What about the latest narrative doesn't embolden Putin? He's pushing forward now at the most difficult time of year to do it. If that weapon situation isn't resolved by spring, and it doesn't look like it will be, why would Putin stop at the Donbass, the land bridge, and Crimea?
From a territory gain point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things I got from our conversation with Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, which I thought was very interesting, we'd sort of covered it, but he brought it out to be a significant point, is that in continuing with this war of attrition, Putin is having to use his latest equipment, which gives visibility to the West. The West is using its old stockpiles. There's only so much of that Putin can actually do. So even maybe Putin is having to play a balanced game here that, yeah, it might feel like he's got the advantage, but he knows he's not got that much time ahead of him before, despite how much money he's got, maybe the weaponry, will sort of run out as well. So is that a problem?
Well, yeah, there is, but I try and simplify this as much as possible. If you simply give Ukraine bullets and artillery rounds, and Russia has bullets and artillery rounds, you end up with an attritional battle. And normally the biggest side wins. They just slug it out on the battlefield, and the more numerous side will win. That is Russia. The big advantage the West has given Ukraine is technology. It's been precision weapons that have been able to precision strike points of Russia, to knock them on the back foot, to inflict heavy casualties, anti-tank weapons that have destroyed the Russian frontline tank force. But once you stop providing those high-tech weapons, suddenly you're back to a big Russian bear wanting to fight a war of attrition. And that's something Ukraine can't afford to get trapped in. So the challenge is, where do these high-tech weapons come from? So either...
And at what cost?
At what cost, yeah. I mean, either you give them the latest high-tech weapons we've got, and I don't think there's any appetite in the West for doing that. We've seen the struggle that Germany's had trying to provide their Taurus missile, which is similar to the Storm Shadow type weapon, and they are prevaricating over whether to send that. But it does feel like it's the last dregs of the cupboard being emptied. And bluntly, unless you actually set up a defence industrial base, spin it up, stop making cars, make artillery shells, stop making Hoovers, make high-tech missiles, that's effectively what Russia's doing at the moment. It's got 3 times the defence industrial base spun up than the West has, and it's buying loads of rounds from North Korea, and it's buying rockets from Iran, and it's got a flow of revenue from the oil because fuel prices are still high.
Okay, so that looks like, an end game to me. And back to your, is it 300 million from America? Now, I would probably fail the test to get on Mastermind with what I'm about to say. But I seem to recall what was going through Congress was 60 billion.
Yes.
So 300 million, 600 million, that's 0.5%, I think.
Very good.
It's 0.5% of what they were trying to get.
Yes.
Which would be a reasonable, a sufficient amount to keep the thing going. 300 million is not going to touch the sides.
No. And the real worry here, I think, is if we take ourselves away from the detail of it, because you're absolutely right, is going, so come springtime, as a former military guy, I'm now looking at this going, right, what was my original aim? And we all think Putin's original aim was to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. It started badly for him. He managed to get in a fair way, then was pushed back. Now he's watching the world. The big ogre here was always America. If America is on the cusp of saying no, and actually Joe Biden can't unlock that money at the moment, Putin's going to feel emboldened. And therefore, why would he not use this? Because the moment he pauses, it will be very difficult to push again, because once he pauses and some form of peace settles, Ukraine will find different partners, different alliances, different military ways of looking after its own future, which will make it more difficult for Russia. This is probably the best window of opportunity that Russia's had in a generation to take Ukraine. And it's a horrible... it makes me shudder just to think about it. But as a military guy, I'm going, this is an opportunity for Putin. Why would he not seize it? Because he's got a point of weakness. He's got an opportunity now to push hard. And even if President Zelensky throws up his arms and says, I want to negotiate, negotiation only works when both sides want to negotiate. If Putin sees an opportunity here, why would he stop? That's a real worry for the West, a real worry. And we seem to be on the cusp of exactly that, of turning a blind eye. We've done all we can, but we're not going to do any more. There's loads more we can do. Politicians, I was listening to Lord Cameron yesterday, very powerful words. We stand with Zelensky till the end.
And how much is he offering?
Fine words.
Right.
They need weapons. They need them now. And that is a commitment. It's a long-term commitment from the country to actually spin up our defence industrial base to deliver the weapons it needs. To date, there's no evidence that the West is doing that. That is very worrying times, not only for Ukraine, but also our long term. And it picks up a point you made earlier. My worry here is that with elections due this year, both here and in America, is this a time when our politicians don't really want to get their hands too dirty? They're more focused on their own futures than they are actually worried about making sure that Ukraine survives.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm very suspicious of what politicians say.
Really?
Yes. Yes. I think they've got a sort of little book to remind them each day they've got to say something about, and David Cameron's got a book that says every other day I've got to say something nice about Ukraine. That's an exaggeration. So I don't put too much store against it. But, I hope what you're suggesting isn't the outcome, as we all are.
I agree entirely. I'm simply painting the picture as I see it at the moment.
So, Sean, we've been talking about local and international defence budgets as actually quite an interesting factor of peacetime and wartime. Post-Second World War, defence budgets were very high for obvious reasons. That settled down. The Cold War, they were higher than what they are now. We then entered what we thought was, long-term peace. The war with Ukraine and Russia, and now Israel and Palestine and Gaza and so on has erupted. Suddenly, our defence budgets come into sharp focus. So 2 questions for you. What are the budgets now and what's the politics behind them? And the second one is, given we've shrunk everything, is it that easy, even if you push up the budget, is it that easy to, as quick, equip yourself to put yourself on a reasonably defensive footing, just in case?
Yeah, so those 2 questions we could talk, well, there'd be a lot of wine on the table to address that one. I think it's going to be a theme we're going to look at for several weeks. We've got a few guests, haven't we, lined up, some political guests, because actually part of this is trying to get underneath this debate, because the debate keeps becoming, is 2% of our GDP, which is the minimum required for NATO, enough? And actually, there's been a recent House of Commons Defence Committee report that said that we're too reliant on our allies, that we are not able to defend ourselves properly. What's interesting about that is actually being a member of NATO is a fundamental pillar of our defence strategy, but 11 of the 32 countries pay their way, pay 2%, the rest do not. Is that right? Why should we pay more money when others are not? Really key point. But I think what, for me, the other factor is Margaret Thatcher's day, Cold War, 4% was our GDP we spent on defence. Cold War dividend, peace dividend, whatever you want to call it, we've now halved the amount we spend on defence. And I got some statistics out. In 1990, the British Army was 153,000. Now it's 73,000. It's less than half its size. The Navy had 138 ships and 38 submarines. and 65,500 people. Now it's got 68 ships, which includes 10 submarines, a fraction of its size, and it's only got 32,000 people. So again, less than half its size. The Royal Air Force was 93,000. It's now 31,000, a third of its size. And it had 30 frontline fast jet squadrons. It's now got 7, a quarter of its size. Now, I will be the first to argue that technology means that you are much more capable, you get much more bang for your buck out of a Typhoon than you ever did out of a Jaguar or a Harrier of my day. But quantity also has a quality of its own. And the worry is, overlaid on all of that, we're spending half the amount of money than we were out of our GDP. Now you look at, out of that defence budget, we now put nuclear in there. Now, it normally costs about 6% of the defence budget. But in these next few years, we're replacing our nuclear submarines. We're replacing our nuclear warheads. That capital cost, there's been a massive debate on whether that should be part of the defence budget or something separate. Because that's a 40 billion slug of money. It's almost a full year's defence budget that's got to come out. There's no more money being put in. As a result, what's going to happen is that the amount of money available within the defence budget is going to shrink even further to accommodate that.
Yeah.
So it's going to make us even tighter financially at a time when Grant Shapps says, this is a really dangerous world. We should be spending more money on defence.
Yeah.
All of those things have come together, and it doesn't feel we're having a proper national debate about how much money we should be spending on defence. And my final point of that, we had a budget only a few days ago. In that budget, despite the rhetoric about spending more money on defence, despite the wars in Ukraine, despite the Houthis attacking, despite Hezbollah, despite Hamas, zero extra money to defence. The government prioritised tax cuts and childcare over defence.
And the reason for that is they don't actually think there's any votes in defence budgets because people don't they don't actually understand what it entails. And as we know, the number one objective of any politician is to get re-elected. And if there's no votes in defence, then it goes off the radar.
But it's such an important issue. And as an ex-military guy, we used to study our military history, and we're never ready for the wars that come round the corner. Yet it feels like it is a dangerous world. And I think we're really keen to understand from our viewers' perspective, what do you think? Do you think 2% is enough? Do you think we should be spending more money on defence?
It's your money.
It's your money. And where would you take it from? How would we create the overhead to be able to do that? Or are we going to risk sleepwalking into not being prepared for the next war? It's a really big issue, and we need to explore that.
Well, and it's not just the amount, but as you pretty strongly implied earlier, it's actually what you spend it on. Because if you're going to spend it on conventional weapons, they take 20 years to wind up. So new tech, smarter ways of actually creating defence capability, which we are seeing, laser beams, drone, all sorts of other things, that's clearly going to be a massive part of our future.
I think there's a couple of other things that I think I'd like to explore. One of them is that the war in Ukraine has shown how technology, particularly around drones, has moved so dramatically quickly. Now, that is not what the military is generally good at in procurement. You've been involved in procurement a long time. Does it do it fast or does it do it slow?
Sorry, what was the question?
Glacially slow is normally. That does not fit comfortably. How do we change the way that we procure, particularly around that agility? And the other thing, we spend a fortune in live training, and yet simulators, network simulators, provide a really interesting way.
Yeah.
I've died many times in a simulator to stop me having to die for real. And there's a much better way of doing training, not just nationally, but internationally as part of alliances, much more cost effective, much more capable operational training. And yet there's some really simple blockers to making it happen. We need to explore those topics, and we're going to do that over the coming weeks.
Yeah, and I think there should be more of a national debate on the subject, actually.
Absolutely right.
So it's a very good point, Sean. So, Sean, we're going to have a very, very special, important guest this afternoon. Wasn't to be today, but hopefully will be soon.
Yeah, and a personal message to Colin Bell, Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, Distinguished Flying Cross. had his 103rd birthday just the other day. He was going to be our special guest today. I was told yesterday that he'd had an abscess under one of his teeth. He's had to have one of his teeth removed. Not much fun when you're young and fit. Even less fun when you're 103 years old. We understand he's recovering fine. We wish him every best with the recovery. But he's promised he will come to us, and we're hoping to get that interview to you very shortly. But for now, our very best wishes to Colin for a full recovery, and our thoughts are with you, mate.